All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Samantha Johnston. I'm the Executive Director and Curator at the Colorado Photographic Arts Center, which is a nonprofit photography center located in Denver. And tonight's program is being recorded and will be added to our website. And if you are in the Denver area and you have not stopped by to see the exhibit Experiences Identity, please do. It is up until April 12th. And this evening's program is set up as a webinar. So the Q&A feature is enabled, so please feel free to type questions there and we will have time to get through questions after all the artists speak tonight. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for the panel discussion for our exhibition, Experiences of Identity, which features the work of Priya Suresh Kambli, Vikesh Kapoor, Emily Hanako Momohara, and Rafael Soldi. And this exhibition came together from me visiting and seeing these artists work at different times over the last few years. And today, more than 40 million people living in the US were born in another country. And the 4 artists in this exhibition utilize different photographic approaches to investigate how immigration has shaped who they are today, using family archives and personal histories as source material. The artists explore themes of home, memory, loss, and the myth of the American dream. So tonight, we're going to be having the artists sharing about their work. And then, as I said, we're going to open it up for more discussion and conversation. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and Priya, I'm going to let you get started.
Yeah, so I'll start with this one and I'll talk a little bit about this one and then I'll move through, I'll talk about the work a little bit more holistically. So I kind of wanted to start with this image because it's a little bit of an outlier in my archive. My work deals with family photographs, and most of the photographs that I work with are photographs that I brought with me when I came to the United States at age 18. But this photograph especially has a little bit of a different story. And so I kind of wanted to start with that one. So this is an image that was made when I was 22 years old. It was made in Louisiana in a photo studio called Bros Studio in Eunice, Louisiana, a small rural community. And it's really significant because this is the day I graduated, and that was a big occasion. My sister had flown in from India, and this photograph was taken and to celebrate sort of this, her coming to the States to see me and me graduating. And in the background, in the foreground is my sister. I'm in the red and my sister is in the blue. And in the background is our surrogate family, which is my mom's sister, her husband, and her child, right? My cousin. And so this image was made also for my sister to take back to India with her. And this image was sort of this representation of life being lived well, you know, of me graduating, of me doing well. And it was really interesting because you hear about the traumas in life that were played out and that kind of really questioned my ability to be productive. And so it was really fascinating that this image then goes back to India, to my uncle's house, my mom's brother's house, and is sort of honored there as life well lived, right? And then they pass away. And then my sister and I are the caretakers of this family and this family legacy. And so I get this photograph back because my sister doesn't want it. And I love this photograph because it's lived in India, in this house in India, in Mumbai, in the humidity of Mumbai, in this leaking house in Mumbai. And it has all these stains of a life lived in there, right? And then it comes back to the United States to me after having lived its own life. And so here I have this artifact who has had a life and I've had a life, but it's my life that's being sort of re-represented in it. And then me recontextualizing and re-altering this photograph, right? With materials that are coming from my kitchen and this flower in there. So Samantha, you can kind of shuffle through. I'm gonna just kind of talk a little bit now holistically about the work. So I just kind of wanted to use that image to kind of think and talk about how I look at family photographs, how I think about them, how I recontextualize them, how I rehouse them, right? So I'm just gonna give sort of a narrative about the work a little bit. The title Buttons for Eyes refers to my mother's playfully nuanced questions. Do you have eyes or buttons for eyes? a question laced with parental fear, which in hindsight echoes broader concerns, not necessarily an individual's inability to see trivial objects right in front of them, but our collective inability to see well enough to navigate in the world. As an artist whose work is bound in the personal and irrefutably placed in the context of migrant narrative, the question in play in my work is, how does the personal or private intersect with the public or political? Or simply, in the face of rising white supremacism in the United States, how do I document my lived personal experience, connecting my migrant story with the universal experience? Buttons for Eyes is informed by the loss of my parents and my migrant experience. Here, I re-photograph my inherited family photographs, documents, and objects carried by me to America to confront questions of my identity, how it's constructed by family trauma, migration, separation, displacement, and my deep-seated need to create a home. Artist Zarina writes, I understood from a very early age that home is not necessarily a permanent place. It's an idea we carry with us wherever we go. We are our homes. The loss of both my parents at age 16 meant a loss of home. By re-photographing my personal photographic archives and memorabilia, I rehoused these images and objects, resituating them within the context of home. Though intensely personal, this work looks outward by documenting a story that has a particular resonance in an ongoing political climate, a story of migration and cultural hybridization, exploring the resulting fragmentation of family, identity, and culture. There's certain questions and things also I'm thinking about the work. And so I'm sort of like summarizing all these thoughts that are like sort of percolating in this body of work and also multiple bodies of work. And this is in consideration to the archival material I'm using, a realization that the family photographs I use have a closer cultural history with me than with my children. It's the monumentalization and mythologizing of my ancestors, of seating them on thrones that I have created and to which I make offerings. It's about growing up in an Eastern culture, immigrating to a Western society, educated in Western institution, and being surrounded by a Western experience, of being a product of both East and West. It means that the work is not other, but part of a complex and diverse makeup of what it constitutes to be an American. It's about new aesthetics, new conceptual critical concept, new subject matter, and new moral imperatives. It's about the power of representation to prove that the American identity is diverse and complex with multiple narratives, but the burden of this lies on the artist of color. It's about photography and its colonial history and its manifestation in my own life. It's about standing in front of my father's Minolta, waiting to be recorded, archived by him, only for these artifacts to be re-photographed by me. In his photograph, I am my father's subject. His photographs are mine. It's about a relationship to a set of family photographs. My sister has the other half. The archive is something full of gaps, an archive that is of a specific time of happiness. It's about re-photographing inside my 110-year-old kit bungalow in the rural Midwest with glass windows that are 110 years old, which ushers light in, natural and molten, altered, my golden hour, where the light is transient and baptismal. It's about using unforgiving mercurial material like flour and spices and rice, using pattern as a representation of culture, obscuring, recontextualizing. Pattern as a cultural shroud of focusing power and intention. Pattern made using these non-Western material grounded in everyday, in worship, in prayer, in substance, and in healing. These patterns are ephemeral, but the act of photographing, of recording preserves them. This recording happening at an auspicious time when the light intervenes and shifts the mundane to the sublime. It's about the feminist practice of rephotographing my father's images. All the images in my archive are photographed by men, bringing my role and gender as a woman in play. This work offering new perspective without omitting the old, as we know, lies under the new surface. This work is about connecting the small fragments that are revealed in a story that's largely obscured. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. Sorry, I was on mute. Vikesh, do you want to start sharing about your work?
Hello. Thanks to everyone that's watching in, and thank you, Samantha, for putting this exhibition together.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful to see my work in conversation with my three fellow artists here in Denver. So the project that I am exhibiting at CPAC is called See You at Home, and it's an ongoing personal narrative about my parents, and it's examining kind of the latent sense of loss that immigrants can feel as they grow old in a non-native culture. My parents have lived in the States for about 4 decades now, and they live in rural Pennsylvania, a town of about 10,000 people. So in a place like that, they're not really surrounded by an immigrant community, nor like a South Asian community, and which I think I've seen has become more increasingly important as one gets older, to have that kind of collectivist support that one would have at their age if they were still based in their where they grew up. And so the work operates on 2 registers. There's the family album archive photographs, like the first photograph you saw. And that was called Before Immigration. That was shortly after their arranged marriage, when they were in Europe, before they immigrated to the States. They had a stopover in Europe for a few years. So there's those photographs, and then contemporary photographs of their life in America. For the installation at CPAC, I decided to treat the archival photographs exactly the same as I do the contemporary ones. And instead of treating the archival photographs as they would be back in 1969, where they might be really small, or where you might see the edges of the frame, I wanted to treat them less like an object and put them on the same level as the contemporary images, in order to create a more seamless viewing experience that I feel was more akin to how we experience memory, which is really an exercise in a slippage of time, as I coined it. We, when we have a memory, we slide into that memory. It's not something we decide to sit down and think about. And so by creating more of a seamless viewing experience, I want these images from the past to kind of just act as like notes that happen every so often. A few of the photographs I've made, there's one that's exhibiting at CPAC as part of this exhibition called Holy Fountain. And it's honestly very similar to this photograph you're looking at right now. The difference is that the photograph you're looking at right now is an old one before I was born. And Holy Fountain is a photograph I made in 2014. But due to the camera I was using and the conditions of the light, it and the film stock, it looks like a point and shoot photograph from the 90s. And I like that. I like having this blur between the past and present. You know, of course, there are photographs like this that are really extravagant. Some have wondered if I set this photograph up. I didn't. I had a small selection of slides that I discovered in my parents' collection, and this was one of them. The work is it's ongoing, and so I'm starting to explore text now and projection and home videos, which has been really invigorating for me, and starting to explore more collaboration with my parents. A photograph like this called The Bouquet, I made shortly before lockdown. And this was my mother's mantle next to her bed. And these were all of the items that were on that mantle. I just shifted them a little bit or moved them over a little bit, but these were the only ones. And I found it really interesting of the lineage of time that's happening from left to right. On the left, you're seeing an old photograph of my parents' wedding. That's them on the far right. My mother has a shawl over her head, and the gentleman in the middle with the white hat is her father, and he's in the process of handing a coconut to my father, which symbolizes the handing over of his daughter. My dad at the time, he's wearing a suit there. At the time, my dad was already living in London and becoming westernized. So my mother was in this process becoming westernized within that photograph. Her life would change completely. The photograph in the middle is of me and my 11th grade school photo, trying to be wearing a tie. I didn't go to a private school. So there was some part of me that was trying to be some model minority or something. And the photograph on the far right was peculiar. It was one that was just sitting there on that pedestal on this mantle, and it was a stock photograph of this blonde-haired, blue-eyed bride. And not only did I find it interesting that we have two bookends of marriage, but one that is from black and white and from the past and from Eastern culture. And as you move to the right, you have one from Western culture that is more of this idealistic woman and bride from what you would try to achieve in America, or what we try to achieve, what we maybe are, maybe what we are kind of conditioned to think is the ideal. It's a more apt way of putting it. The work started out purely as documentary and on 35 millimeter. And it was a way for me to just make memories with my family when I would go back to visit them. And as I started to gain an understanding of what I was actually doing and having a concept for the project, I graduated to a 6x7 camera, though I still use the 35 millimeter. I'm embracing these different formats to not only create that blurring of the past and present, but also I feel that that's more aligned with the spirit of how you would see a wall of photographs in any family's home, especially ones from the 90s, 80s, 70s, where it is kind of a smattering of different kinds of formats and fidelity and framing and stuff like that. So, because this project is ongoing, I am still experimenting with how to exhibit the work. And so for the CPAC show, everything is matted in the same size frame, more or less, depending on the film ratio, and in a way to kind of create that seamless experience that I mentioned. But I am also experimenting with doing something completely opposite, where there are a lot of different sizes, or some things are adhered right to the wall as vinyl, while some are framed, and there's kind of an overlay happening, and kind of a mosaic of past and present and future. Now that I'm experimenting more, setting up photographs more straight, I would say fine art photography, where it's not so much documentary. That's where I'm starting to get my parents involved. And that's been interesting to start looking at texts old love letters that they wrote to each other shortly after their arranged marriage, before they lived together. Those have been pretty fascinating to see, especially in light of how much time has passed. They've now been married for 53 years. So I hope that the project not only speaks to the South Asian experience and kind of aging in this culture. I think that I'm still learning about the history of South Asians in America, apart from the Sikhs who came very early to California in the 1800s. Generally, there was a huge surge of South Asians from like 1969 to 1975, and my parents came in 1972. So we're just, for the bulk, from what I've learned, the bulk of South Asians that have immigrated, we're just now starting to see them getting to this point in history where they're aging. And so I'm curious of how that's affecting them, having, grown up in a culture that was very collectivist, where they would have certain kinds of support, especially as they age, versus now where they're living in an individualistic one, and they're kind of living in this middle space. And then, of course, that brings up larger questions of being the kin of, these people. And so someone like myself, who's first generation, it wouldn't be the first time you're hearing it, that often first generation Americans feel that they're stuck between two cultures. So I grapple with, well, what is my duty to them? Should I be taking care of them at this point in their lives as they would have been taken care of in India? Or should I be solely pursuing my dreams because they've enabled me to do that with all the changes and sacrifice they made in order to adapt to Western culture and this myth of the American dream. So these are questions I'm asking and themes I'm grappling with as I continue the project. But it's been really invigorating to see other South Asians see themselves within the project, be able to relate to it. And then, of course, there's just the general theme of aging, which I think anybody can relate to when taking care of their parents. And of course, we have very famous photographic projects in the canon that document family. And I'm hoping that I can create a new dialogue for that isn't solely from like a Western white man's view. And because there are plenty of other people going through this in the country. So there are all these things working together, and yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing the project, and I've appreciated all of the support, and it's been wonderful to be a part of an exhibition like this, where it's the first one I'm hearing of where we're all artists of color and kind of exploring these things. It's really, I think it's much needed, especially in larger institutions. So thank you to CPAC and Samantha. Thank you to Rafael, Priya, and Emily. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Vikesh. Emily, do you want me to jump right into the video? Or do you want me to wait a second?
You can wait a second.
Okay.
Just listening to Priya and Vikesh talk about their journeys of both their own and then exploring their families' journeys, it really is hitting home with what my process was for this project as well. The project is, or what's being shown in the gallery right now is work from the Fruits of Labor body of work that I created. And it is titled that because the work is about agriculture and immigrant labor and mainstream consumption. One of the things that Vikesh was just talking about, why groups of people come from different geographic areas to the United States, and for Okinawan Americans, there's not a lot of information after this kind of beginning of Japanese immigration, because Okinawa was a territory of Japan. And at the time when my family came over, which was 1914, they were still considered different than the Japanese. um, and now, of course, we don't think about them very different. But I love to hear these stories about how other people are finding out information about their families. Um, so with that, I'm going to jump on in here, and you can change it to, I think you have the stereograph in there.
I do.
Oh,
I can go to the stereograph and then go back. If that's...
okay. Um, yeah, so this work is all about agriculture, immigration, labor, consumption, um, and you're going to see in the various pieces that I'm really interested in taking these historic footage, historic images, and combining that with contemporary images, or the life that we now lead, or maybe the side-by-side version of what a white American or mainland American might have experienced at that time. And this is a stereograph, which some of you may know what it is. I see a lot of familiar photographer names in the lists there of folks attending. So, but for those of you who are not photographers, and have not seen a stereograph before, this is a device that one would look at as a form of entertainment. So if you went on vacation, or you were someone came back from a exotic location, they might give you this card, and you could look through it, and it would kind of show a three-dimensional view of whatever that place is. This stereograph, there's two of them in the exhibition. This one is actually a historic image of a Hawaiian pineapple plantation worker. So someone actually in the fields working, which is the whole idea of watching someone else, and another person of color out in the fields working as entertainment, is really, kind of the crux of what this work is about, right? Where those tensions lie. So we can go ahead and start the video. Thank you, Samantha. So this work is called Semiotics of a Pineapple Upside Down Cake. And I am using historic footage from Hawaii pineapple fields. And then it's also combined with footage of a Western female appearing person consuming these products. Very domestic scene. Immigration is so tied to labor and consumption. When we look at my family working in the fields, it is not unlike similar immigration issues that we see today. And so we were talking earlier about how, we've been doing a lot of these kind of Zoom conversations, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. So instead of talking about each piece, I would love to just read a little narrative that I have here as you are watching this video. So we will go for this. Let's see, you are my guinea pigs on this, so I apologize in advance. All right. Let's see. Oops. The woman's day began before the sun rose. She takes a few moments before everyone wakes to wrap her newborn across her body and enjoy his sweet smell. Then she starts breakfast in the tiny kitchen of the 5-room home. Her husband and the 7 other children eat breakfast as she washes dishes. The neighborhood cats gather around her as she feeds them, and the chickens too. The adults walk to the pine field. The plantation is adjacent to Hanapepe town. She spends the next 4 hours bent over, tending to their section of the pine field. Roots of invaders pulled from the earth. The baby is still strapped to her body. Luckily, he sleeps. They break for lunch. She hands him the bento she has packed, and they eat with other Okinawans and talk story. Though the rice makes her sleepy, she continues one long row at a time. One of the kids runs up into the field to tattle on one of the others. She placates the child, sends him home, and returns to work. In the afternoon, they steal a short rest and drink water. It's hot now, and sweat is soaking into her clothes. The woman finishes the day as the sun is low. She hurries home to feed her children. As the sun sets, it's bath time for everyone. 6 hours after the woman rose that morning, another woman in Cincinnati wakes. Eggs, toast, bacon, if there is any. The 3 kids and husband eat before heading out. The littlest is still at home. She sets him in a playpen. She cleans. Her vacuum is a godsend. The woman makes lunch for herself and the child. They eat and play. Their voices echo across the yard. She helps him try to stand on the chubby, wobbly legs. He will soon be walking. For dinner, the husband is bringing over a friend from work. She picks up the can of sliced pineapple she splurged on at the grocery this week. The sweet treat will be perfect to impress her guest. Her cookbook says a pineapple upside-down cake is the best pineapple dessert. Flour, brown sugar, baking powder, baking soda, oil, cherries, and of course, pineapple. With care and love, she makes the cake, filling the house with an enticing aroma. The husband's guest gushes with compliments about the pineapple upside-down cake. The citrus is sweet, the color vibrant, the brown sugar savory and decadent. The guest is indeed impressed. The husband is pleased. The children are exhilarated, and the woman has delivered. Thank you. I think that I'll stop there, and hopefully if you get a chance to go to the gallery, you will get to see the end of this pineapple upside down cake being created and the workers that are laboring on the interior.
Thanks, Emily. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. Rafael.
Thank you. Thanks, Samantha. And really, I'm lucky enough to go at the end because I feel like I connected to so many of the things that came up and you know, the short talks that all 3 of you gave, and I connected to it in so many different ways. Also, Emily, that was very soothing. Thank you. I felt very, it was like a lovely meditation. It was beautiful. So I wanted to start with showing some images from a body of work if I'm looking this way, it's because I have two screens, so I'm not ignoring you. A body of work titled Imagined Futures is very connected to the work that's currently on view. And this is actually the work that Samantha and I had originally talked about including in the show, and it just wasn't available because it was in another show. But this is a body of work that for me changed in a really big way, just the direction in which my practice was moving. And primarily, it was the first time that I think I addressed very head on my relationship to Peru. I'm Peruvian. I was born and raised there. I moved to the United States when I was a teenager. So I've, a really significant part of my life, my formative years were spent there. And it was particularly challenging to grow up there as a queer kid. I think was really difficult to be a queer kid in a place that was very homophobic, that was very conservative, that was very religious, very Catholic. And a lot of my experiences and my childhood memories were rooted in that. I was fortunate to grow up in a loving family and to be provided for in so many different ways. But it was also sad that I just, you just couldn't escape society. You couldn't escape the narratives that were fed to you through the media, through your peers, through other family members, through the world around you. And something that was always difficult for me as a kid was imagining my future, because I found that as children, we are fed an idea of what your future should be. In my case, it was like, oh, you're going to get married to a woman, you're going to have children, you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, or all of these things. And I think these are very pervasive ideas in more than just Latin culture. I have a feeling that all of us can relate to that in some kind of way. And I was aware of my queerness from a really young age, even when I couldn't put words to it. And I was aware very early on that none of those options were right for me. So I think I felt a sort of dread from a very young age about feeling like the future for me was going to be difficult, feeling like I was going to have to choose these options that were offered to me, and I was going to have to suck it up, or I was going to have to pretend to be someone else. And I just always had this overwhelming fear of, like, the closer I get to graduating from high school, the closer I get to the moment where I have to put on the show of my life and pretend to be this totally different person. I moved to the US when before I graduated high school, as a teenager, before I went off to college, before I had to choose a career and all of those things. And I found that I carried a lot of that, that feeling with me, because I didn't have an opportunity to exercise my future there. And instead I landed here. I feel very lucky that I got to go to art school and come out and live the kind of life here that I always wanted to live. But I found that I had a difficult relationship with the way my child self pictured his future, and that was weighing very heavy in my psyche, and that I needed to just find a way to address it. On the other hand, excuse me, the older I got, the more I started to wonder what my life could have been like if I had gone back to Peru. The more I went back and met people my age who were gay, who were out, who were artists, whose lives were relatively fine. And I started to think, like, did I make a mistake? Did I, should I have left? Did I run away too soon? Did I betray sort of my own country, my own culture, to seek something out there that maybe I could have gotten at home? And I think personally that most immigrants wouldn't leave their home if they could get everything that they wanted and needed in the place where they were born, where their families are, where their culture is. So I think I was simultaneously holding this weight of the way my child self saw my future, and then this guilt that my sort of older self was having about all the futures that were left behind that never got lived, that were sort of abandoned, all these, what I call these imagined futures. And I just felt like I needed to find a way to grieve them and to mourn them and to let them go. So what I did over the course of 2 years is that every time one of these futures would visit me and I referred to them as these sort of apparitions or these visions of the future would come to me, essentially anytime I would think about it, I would find a photo booth, I would step into it, and I would, feed the machine, close my eyes, and address it directly and say, thank you for coming, thanks for visiting. And I'm sorry it didn't work out between us, but it's time for you to go. And I would just give them permission to go and find someone else to live them, perhaps someone who was better suited than me to embody that future. And I chose to work in this way for a number of reasons. Primarily, the photo booth really reminded me of the Catholic confessionals that I grew up around. It was a huge part of my childhood, and I have really strong feelings about this idea of being a child and being sort of, I don't know if forced is the right word, but psychologically forced to go into this small chamber and tell a strange man on the other side of a curtain all my secrets, and that he was the one to decide and tell me, how I should repent. And the fact that I always knew I had a big secret. I always knew I was gay, but I never once confessed to it. But I always knew that it was wrong, and I always knew that I was hiding it. And I think there's a really just powerful relationship to that. So I wanted to reclaim that space and make it my own, to have a way to tell my own secrets, to talk about my own life in that space. I also knew that I didn't want to use a camera. I knew that I wanted to be able to go anywhere in the world and focus on the sort of ritual aspect of the work and have a studio that could just follow me, a way of making the work that could follow me. And in this case, the booth presented that perfect opportunity. It allowed me also to engage in a really interesting way with this picture making device. From a sort of emotional kind of conceptual perspective, I could step into the womb of this camera and make a picture from within it, from inside of it, which felt special. And also photo booths have such a interesting and fertile relationship to performance too. Even looking all the way back from, how photo booths were created as a device to make ID photographs, all the way up to people like Warhol playing with gender and identity, and also just down to drunk people stepping into a photo booth and using it to perform another version of themselves and have this sacred little moment inside this cabin. And then from a formal and logistical perspective, also the booth made a gelatin silver print. So where else can you pay $3 to make a gelatin silver print in 5 minutes? That was really helpful. I knew that it would last. I knew that I could wash it, that I could, fix it, that a museum conservator would know what to do with it. I knew that it set a set of constraints and that it created parameters for the work. So while every booth had its own personality, all the images would be the same size and the same scale, and they would all be black and white, and they would be analog. So it solved a lot of problems at once. And the last thing I'll say about this particular iteration of the work is that, and this is something that Miguel Lopez, who's a curator who wrote the essay for the book, pointed out, is that the photo booth was first created as a way for governments to create, as a way to create ID photographs. And ID photographs were born at the turn of the 20th century as a way for governments to make photographs of criminals and deviants, including homosexuals. And it was a way of cataloging and keeping a record of anybody who was considered a deviant within their society or their culture. He also made a really interesting connection to death portraits, which were quite common also in the early 20th century. So there's a lot in there to unpack, but we can move forward to the work that's in the show, and I can talk about that. And I should mention that the final installation of Imagined Futures was 50 images that were all together. So the work that's in the show, these images are from a show that was up in Wyoming, down this, just not far from Denver, and but they're the exact same works. And when I finished this work, I was very happy with how it came out, and I was very happy with some of the work that I was able to do with myself around processing and working through some of these feelings and sort of difficult connections to my past. But what I found was that overwhelmingly, I kept having conversations with other immigrants who were saying, I felt the same thing. I've had a lot of guilt around, the opportunities that I may have left behind, or I have a lot of difficult feelings around the futures that never sort of manifested in my home where I came from, or I had feelings as a kid about seeing myself or not seeing myself in having a future in this place. And I wanted to find a way to take the framework of the project and introduce it so that other people could also work through some of those ideas as well. And I got a grant here in Seattle from For Culture, and I partnered with Entre Hermanos, which is an organization that was founded around in the 1990s during the AIDS crisis to support Latinx men who were struggling through the AIDS crisis in Seattle, who did not have access to healthcare. And they're still around, and they've done a lot of work in the queer community, particularly with queer men, and more recently just opening it up to the whole community. And we partnered and we invited a group of queer Latinx men to join us for an evening of sort of a workshop conversation and to make these works. I paid all of them as part of the grant. And alongside a social worker, we mediated a 2-hour sort of conversation between them where I shared my work very briefly. I told them about the work that I had done, and then I invited them to share their own experiences and their own stories of how they related to their future as children and how they relate to their futures now. And it became a really powerful sort of testament from each of them. There was a lot of just really beautiful, vulnerable sharing and crying. And so many of them said that they saw themselves so much in each other's stories and that they had never talked about any of these things, like openly or publicly, or that there were things that were very abstract for them that they had never been able to put words to it. And at the end of the session, I had built a photo booth, and I invited each of them. Everybody left the room, and I invited each of them into the booth, and I invited them to close their eyes. They held a cable release, and I talked them through some of the questions that we discussed earlier and the questions that I asked myself during making my work. And I said, when and or if you're ready, you're welcome to make a portrait of yourself anytime during this time. You don't have to make one. And these were the 6 people who chose to make a portrait of themselves during that time that we spent together sharing this sort of meditation. And that's the work that's on view at the center. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, all of you, for sharing and for talking more about your projects. I think this is such an important part of not only for your project, to make the work and to put the work out there, but then also to be able to have the space to talk and to share more about what's happening with the work. I have a few questions I want to kind of ask, but then if anyone who's in listening, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. My first question is to kind of Vikesh and to Priya, because you're both really using, I mean, Emily as well, you're using found imagery. Priya and Vikesh more specifically from Family Archives. Emily, if I'm misspeaking, if you're not using from Family Archive, please let me know. But I just wanted you to kind of talk a little bit more about how you're, I was really interested in the ways you both spoke differently about how you're utilizing those images. Priya, the description of that first image, how it was taken in the States, went back to India, came back, that kind of denigration of the images, but then also Vikesh, how you're speaking to the images of their original size, but then changing that scale, I think is really interesting. If you guys could talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to stop sharing. Whoever wants to jump in.
I'll go ahead. So most of the images that I'm working with are family photographs that I brought with me when I came to United States. I came here at age 18. I came here alone. I had family here, but I had a sibling that decided, we were both given the choice to come here to study, and she decided to stay in India, and I came here. So when we left, when I left India, my sister knew, for whatever reason, I think I was very naive in my decision, that this was a permanent separation. And so we split everything we had in half. The thing that really we were sort of like we had in our treasures, in our inheritance, were family photographs, because my father was a big documentarian, and for whatever reason my family had been very well photographed in Indian studios or however. And so the images I'm using are from that archive, half of that archive that I brought with me. When I first started using them, I think I was using them to create a relationship with the people in the photographs, and I've been working with the archive for almost 16 years, and I've realized that my relationship to the archive is longer than my relationship to the people in the photographs. And so I've realized that I started off with this intention of creating a relationship, and really truly what I've created is a relationship with the archive. And I'm really interested in the photograph and the conversation, or the ability of what a photograph does, the gesture, the portraits, and its ability to kind of capture this representation. And so when I'm looking at work, I'm really looking at it from a photographic eye rather than a nostalgic eye or anything like that, and really looking at images that are kind of in some way like interesting images themselves, and then what I can do in terms of recontextualizing them, because I'm aware that these images, even though I claim as mine, are appropriated images and are not my images. And so if I need to have conversations through them, I have to alter and shift the narratives that are embedded in those work.
Just to respond to that, Priya, I know Priya and I have spoken about, actually, I think these exact same bodies of work together previously. So I think there's a lot of conversation that happens between them. But one thing, when I had gone to Okinawa the first time with my father to try to find our family. So during World War II, of course, all communication was cut off between the American living family and the Japanese family, right? So we went back in 2011 to try to reconnect with folks, and one aspect of doing that was that some of the stories that I had heard around our family mythology, right, around photos, about when things were taken, who was related to who, why so and so left Okinawa. It's much of that was myths. It wasn't true, right? And that's kind of how we relate to photographs of our family anyways, right? Like we build up these stories around these images. And it was really hard for me to grapple with at first. I felt cheated in some way, but then I realized that, the stories that I heard were probably the ones that my family members wanted us to know about the family, and how they wanted the family to continue to grow. And those are part of me, and those are part of my cousins and my father's generation. And so that those untruths are just as important as the new information that we found out. And those images just take on more information, not changed information.
Yeah, like that idea, those memories and what we attach, and especially with childhood or imageries from family archives, I think there's always that someone else's story or someone else's memory. I think that's a really great point, Emily. Rafael, I want to talk a little bit more too about, and for me, it's because I obviously spend almost every day in the gallery, so I get to spend a little more time every day with each kind of project and sit with the work. And I'm always taken by, and I think you and I talked about this a little at the opening, but in your images and the choice, the eyes being closed. I know you spoke about this, but it's also so interesting as I talk to people who come into the space and that conversation about how that, people are always asking, they're so interested in that choice of why the art, why the portraits, their eyes are closed. And I obviously share and tell about the story, but it just is interesting how that conversation develops, because we often think of the eyes so much when we think of the portrait.
Yeah, thank you. I do get that question a lot too. And I mean, there isn't sort of one single answer about that. And I addressed it a little bit in talking earlier, but one of the things I love about making work, and I'm sure that I can speak to all on behalf of all three of us about this, but I feel like it's, when you go to school, sort of you're expected to write an artist statement and with your work, and that's what the work is about. But to me, the most exciting part about making work is everything that you learn about your work after it's made. It was actually interesting because I've heard, Priya, I've heard you talk about your work quite a few times before, and I feel like today I heard you say, and I'll go back to this in a little bit, but I heard you say some things that I haven't heard you say before. And I was just like, oh, how cool that we as artists kind of over time learn to contextualize our work in different ways as we talk to other people and other perspectives kind of enter our orbit. But one of the things that, the closing of the eyes, I think in the moment of making the work just felt right. Like it just felt like this is how the work needs to be. And over time, I think I've come to understand a lot more about, I think, being asked that question about the power and the importance of closing the eyes. And to me, it just made sense because I was doing this thing that was very internal, and it wasn't about performing for the camera or I felt like when I did some early tests, and when I had my eyes open, it became very much like a self-portrait. And I weirdly don't think of these as self-portraits, even though there are pictures of myself. The eyes in any portrait are sort of the way we enter a human, the way we enter, a psyche, the way we connect to a human face. And I like the idea of in the act of closing the eyes and then printing the work and putting the work on the wall, of saying, denied, this is mine, it's not yours, this is a conversation between me and myself, and this is something that has to happen inside of me. And I'm inviting you to understand the process, but it's not yours, So I sort of came to understand that over time too, how there was almost a selfishness in people wanting to see, why are the eyes closed? Why are you not letting me in? That I thought was interesting too.
That's great. And Vikesh, I was thinking how I had written a note to myself because I had wanted to ask in that bouquet image, and I was so glad you explained that the images that are within that photograph of the picture of your parents, but then also the picture of you from school, but then the photo with what seeming is a bride. And I kept coming back to that image in the gallery, being like, I can't connect. I'm having a hard time connecting. I'm really curious. So is there any more to that? Why that image is there? Why your mom put that image in her room?
I think this question speaks directly to what Rafael just said, which is sometimes you don't know when you're making work. That's why I'm not a writer. Sometimes I'm just making the work because I feel something, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's only so much I can explain. And even what I just said a little bit ago about kind of seeing the linearity of these different stages from east to west. That's just something I figured out recently. I didn't arrange them in that order. They were there in that order. I just shifted them for the light or for the camera. But so that's interesting to me, making those kinds of discoveries and inherent to my project, the reason I started was to understand my family more, understand my connection with them. So if I had all the answers, if I had all the answers to why this, why that, then what am I doing? You know, so it's like it's an exploration of that. And perhaps that's complicating it for me by sharing work like this, by exhibiting before it's done, but that's just how it's been. And my instinct is that some of those questions will never be answered, because and that illustrates this in-betweenness, you know, like what you're saying, like you kept coming back to it, you didn't know how to resolve it. Maybe there's nothing to resolve there, you know?
Yeah.
The feeling that my parents have, the feeling I have about where they're at in their lives, the feeling of like, what is my understanding of myself to them, that may never be resolved. It probably won't be resolved. And so that grappling will be a constant through this work. And it's really just a matter of capturing those feelings, that latency that will always exist there, you know? And that's what's beautiful about everyone's work, is it's so enriched and it's not didactic, you know, it's not journalism.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Absolutely. No, and I think I love hearing that you're still exploring that work and thinking about different ways to show it, to experience it with projection, with, you know, hanging methods. And I think that only comes from starting to get the work out there and getting the work in spaces to then make more determinations about that installation, or the way I'm hanging that maybe isn't working as an art, you know, or it's working for that particular moment in time, but then how can it continue to grow? And I think that's such an important part of being an artist and having that practice. So, I mean, even Priya, seeing your work, you know, Buttons for Eyes, but seeing the work before that and how that archive developed, you know, throughout those projects. So, yeah.
And the archive is also always being updated as well. That's going to continue to be updated, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's an honor for me to be able to have these experiments with artists who have been doing this longer than I have, and have greater understandings of this, like the three sitting here today. So to be able to have those experiments and learn and share that publicly is, you know, it's one way of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't know if there's any other questions in our group that is participating. I know it's always hard with the webinar, but I think but if there's a question from Larry. Last night during a discussion after an artist lecture, I said that I spend way more time paying attention to curators and artists than I do to critics. It's discussions like this that are the reason why. Well played. Thank you, Larry. And if there are
question, Samantha.
Yeah.
Well, I have a couple of quick comments and a question. One, just on the archive, something that I thought was interesting. I have a friend who collects snapshots, you know, and I think a lot of people out there collect old snapshots, but he has a collection of about 15,000 snapshots, and the National Gallery of Art did a major show of his work many years ago. And something that he's always told me that I thought was interesting is that 99% of the snapshots that he finds, they're American snapshots, are of white people. You know, he's like, it's really rare to find snapshots of brown people or Black people. And that's because people of color hold on to their histories. They hold on to their family histories. They don't throw them away. And whereas you can go to any flea market and find thousands of pictures of white people. And I just thought that was a really interesting, when he said that to me, I was like, you're so right. And he's white, you know, and I just had never thought about him. He was like, you will not see a family of color throw away their history, either because they came here from somewhere else and they're worth a lot, or they just simply have a different connection to that type of archive. So just, you know, that came to mind as you all were talking about that. And then the other thing, it's a question for Emily, but also by way of a comment that that Priya made. Priya had never heard you before talk about the feminist element in your work of you altering pictures made by men. And it made me think of Emily, your video piece. I'm making an assumption here that there's a connection to Martha Rosler's semiotic of the kitchen, and it's such a big part of, you know, the title of the piece and the way the video is filmed. And I'm just curious if you could touch on that sort of, you know, sort of pinnacle of feminist art as an inspiration for this work.
Well, yeah, and of course, you know, Martha Rosler is an icon, right? So it's very presumptuous of me to steal that that language, but I rarely make work about the men in my family history. I don't know. I don't know why that is. Especially like I had a great relationship with my grandfather, but I'm really drawn to those women's stories, and in that video piece, it talks about feminism in some layered ways. You know, we've got the woman who's working in the pineapple fields, but then you know, the immigrant woman who is sacrificing and laboring so that her children are educated in this Western style and have opportunity. And then we have the woman on the mainland who is still not an equal to her partner, but is definitely privileged in that they are consuming really the labors of other, you know, brown and black people. So there's these layers of that feminist story in that piece, and I felt like you know, in Rosler's video, she goes through each tool, you know, and I kind of felt like these were like peeling those layers off the onion, you know, in the same kind of way. So, and I just actually gave a talk about that piece at the Feminist Art Project. So it was, you know, it's definitely very much in that line. Yeah.
Thank you. I love that.
Yeah. And I loved the narrative that you read with the video tonight.
Thank you. I've never done it before. I literally wrote it yesterday, so.
That's great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank all four of you so much. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for speaking about your work more. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. As I said, this will be recorded and put onto the website. And yes, if you're in Denver, I hope you have time to see the show. It's really fantastic. And thank you all for joining us. See you all soon. Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.